Hello, this is a video where I'm going to talk about my new novel, which was just released with Atmosphere Press a few days ago. This novel, Year of the Puffin, here it is. And I guess you could say this is a promotional video of sorts, but it's also just a discussion. I just feel like talking about the writing process, getting into it a little bit. So that's basically what I'm going to talk about with this. I mean, no, for no particular end. I just, just feel like it. I'm not back in Iceland yet. For those of you who are in Iceland, which I suspect is the, just about everybody who's watching this. I'm in Vienna still. There's Vienna behind me, if you can see it. Sitting outside right now because it's still very warm and sunny here. Been here for a while, a couple of months since early June. We'll be coming back soon. So publishing this novel, it feels like a momentous development because I've kind of been involved in some kind of form of publishing previously. I self-published my first novel on Amazon Kindle. There's been some short stories as well, but to actually have the hard copy that I can hold in my hands does feel like a sort of a new development, and that's kind of what is inspiring this to talk about it. So the writing process, this is kind of just the condensed history of myself as a writer of fiction. From a very early age, I would say, I always assumed that I would be a writer and writer of fiction because that's what I was interested in when I was younger. I mean, that was always my main focus, my passion. From the time I would say that I was a very little kid, I was just fascinated with books and stories and wanted to write them and wanted to read them as well. And so that was my main interest when I was growing up. And I would say that when I was in grade school, my teachers tended to encourage that. And they too, I think, assumed that I would be a writer, or they just always assumed that that's sort of the direction I would go in because that was clearly what I was good at, right? And it was also clearly what I was most interested in lieu of, the various other things in school. And I would say I sort of assumed I would be a writer, but I didn't really have a grasp of it as a profession. I think that's probably typical for a lot of kids. You kind of think of being a writer as the equivalent of any job, whether it's being a teacher or a carpenter or firefighter or lawyer or whatever, that you would go to school or get training, and then you would reach a certain point where you're a professional, and at that point you're getting paid to be a writer, and that's it. That's your profession. Well, the fact of the matter is that being a writer isn't really like that. It's a much more kind of freelance thing. And that's what I discovered over time, that there's a lot more in the way of just independently trying to find your own way and to kind of hustle as you go. I mean, some writers have a built-in audience, best-selling authors. They publish a book and they know it's going to sell. People will buy it. They'll be interested in this author's work. So too with celebrities who publish a memoir and they know it's going to sell because people are going to be interested in this individual's life. But for the overwhelming majority of writers, it's not like that. You kind of have to strive to get your work out there and to find an audience. I remember once I got to high school, though, I didn't really pursue writing fiction that much. I must have dabbled in it here and there, but it really went underground for a long time, almost a decade, I think it was, in retrospect, from the time I was 14 until my mid-20s. Part of that was environment. I mean, my high school was not really conducive to the arts and humanities. I often felt like those things didn't really exist in my school, that the focus was entirely on math and science, and the teachers were not interested in encouraging that and promoting that. I think that was part of it. But another part of it, a big part of it, was just stuff that happened in my life at that time. And due to a variety of things, of struggles in my adolescence, which eventually kind of, appeared as this kind of larger thing, a kind of larger downward spiral, if I'm being honest. I mean, I did not feel creative, and I did not feel as though I could actually write fiction. And so, as I say, I never, pursued it in any focused sense. And I think that continued up through my early 20s, my undergrad years. I got into just the research-based writing because I was an English student writing essays, and so that, I would say, became my main focus for a while. Afterwards, But creative writing, it just really wasn't on the agenda so much for me at the time. And I think it was partly the focus of my studies, but it was also a loss of confidence. I wasn't sure if I was going to be a good writer of fiction. I'd always assumed that that was my talent and that's what I was supposed to do. But there was this reluctance, I would say, to really open myself up to that for fear of failure and that I wouldn't actually be a good writer. And so that, I would say, persisted all the way into my early to mid 20s. When I finally returned to writing fiction, I was already in a PhD program in Montreal, and that was all oriented towards research because you're writing a doctoral dissertation and also teaching as well. But I actually started writing fiction. I was in a writer's workshop with a couple of other friends, and I really got into it in an intense way, and I wrote a lot of novels at that point, especially I would say in my 20s. I mean, I'm not sure how many total, but it's probably at least 7 or 8 that I just wrote back to back in succession, the longest of which was, I think, over 800 pages. And this thing that had always been there, it kind of came out in a big rush at that time where there was just this compulsion just to write fiction and to write as much as I possibly could. It might have even been this kind of panicky feeling that I was going to miss out on the opportunity to do this thing that I'd always wanted to do. And so that basically is what happened during those years. Sorry, I just had to adjust this to get a little bit more shade. Yeah, so as I was saying, I wrote all this fiction, and at a certain point, I thought that's really what I wanted to do, as opposed to pursuing an academic career. But then, of course, you come up against the kind of the wall of publishing. I did submit some stuff, and I had some success here and there, landing short stories, including one in The Fiddlehead, which was probably the biggest triumph of my fiction writing career, because The Fiddlehead is probably the most prestigious literary magazine in Canada, and they accept very few stories. I also had an agent at one point as well, but nothing happened with any of the novels that I'd written, and that's kind of par for the course. I think my fiction writing at the time, I'll go out on a limb and say it was probably decent, competent, but the publishing market is just way too small for all the decent, competent writers of fiction who are out there. There are so many people who can write a novel or who have a story to tell, but they won't get the opportunity to actually publish their work because these literary markets tend to be quite small worlds, and there's a lot of different factors that go into publication, and they don't all revolve simply around the quality of someone's work. So I would say that I tapered off at a certain point, written a lot of fiction, but then I entered into this early career stage. This would have been in my 30s, my early to mid 30s, where I was just focused on trying to develop a career. And let me tell you, for those who go through this or experience this, the post-PhD stage in particular, the academic job market, can really be a sort of a mire that you get stuck in because of the amount of stress that goes into it and the struggles. And a similar issue with publishing fiction is just the market is way too small for the number of people who are qualified. And that, I think, led to a kind of a single-minded focus for me, a narrowing of vision. And I sort of turned away from fiction a little bit, partly because I was just consumed all the time with publishing research and writing applications, doing job interviews. It just felt like that just soaked everything up, especially when you get into writing academic books. I mean, those are just these giant sponges that just soak up the hours and the days and the weeks. So part of it was just a practical thing, whereas during the PhD program I had more flexibility with my time, a bit more autonomy with my time. So it was partly that, but again, it was partly also just being stressed out all the time and being, to be candid, unhappy, because, you know, that kind of situation where you're just struggling to sort everything out career-wise, struggling to get a regular position as opposed to something that's just temporary, I mean, that can really have a corrosive effect, I think, on your behavior and your thinking. And similar to my adolescence, similar to high school, it did not lend itself to feeling creative. And so, again, it was kind of putting fiction aside for a long time. So I came back to it again, and here you can see the theme of kind of moving across in waves over time. When I came to Iceland, I was teaching at Háskóli Íslands, the University of Iceland. I wrote a longish novel called Bálk, which is an Icelandic word, self-published out on Kindle. This novel, Year of the Puffin, which I wrote, I guess it's about the last year or so. I guess I started writing it in March, not this previous March, but the March before. Wrote this novel too. And by this point, I would say I was experienced with writing fiction just because I'd written a lot of it. And I felt as though the quality of my work was better than it had been previously. I still don't know how good it really is, but I think it had improved over time. And I think that just going through this whole thing, this whole trajectory has led me to some conclusions, which I think are probably obvious, but nonetheless bear repeating if you're interested in pursuing fiction, if you're interested in pursuing a writing career, not just writing novels, but writing of any sort, I would say. So what are the important things, the lessons? Well, do it, I think, is the most important lesson. I mean, that's what I had to learn over time the hard way. As I said, for a long time when I was younger, I thought I had writing talent, but I wasn't pursuing it. I wasn't doing it, and thus it just lapses. And then when you come back to it, you really have to kind of rediscover it, which I did over time. Don't be afraid of failure, and don't be afraid of your work not being good the first time. I mean, as I said, I was afraid of that when I was younger, and those fears were justified to an extent. Remember the first novel I wrote, this would have been when I was 25 or something like that. I remember it, I mean, not super well, but I do have this vague memory of it. This first novel was terrible. It's awful. I mean, I know it's awful. But it was a first novel. It was the first time I was doing it. You can't expect just to sit down and have this lightning bolt of inspiration and you produce something brilliant. You know, that you just dredge out this kind of brilliant novel that's lurking inside all along. It's not like that. It's just the practice of doing it regularly. And that's the only way I became a better writer of fiction, more confident, more comfortable with writing fiction. It was just by doing it continuously over time. And it takes a long time. Graham Greene says something like this as well in his autobiography. I forget the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of, it takes years to clear away the illusions, the delusions, the fantasies, the things that writers cling to in their minds. You have to clear those out in order to really write in a way that another person wants to read your work. So that's the kind of backstory. Year of the Puffin, as I say, just released with Atmosphere Press. That's a kind of hybrid publishing company. And I will say that this is kind of the direction I went in as a writer. I mean, as I mentioned before, the kind of traditional publishing route, it's a very small world in many respects. And if you're not really in those network circles, then it's that much more daunting and challenging. So I would say for all of these other avenues, whether self-publishing, hybrid presses, small independent presses, whatever they might be, well, they do provide an opportunity because, as I say, I think there are way more decent, competent writers of fiction out there than those who actually get published through mainstream major presses. In fact, I know that's the case. So I just see it as, why not get your work out there? I mean, if you're reasonably satisfied with it, then go for it. That's my kind of sense of it. So the novel itself, we'll just talk about a little bit. I don't know if this is a promotion or just a kind of commentary, general commentary. So this novel is not about birds. It is, in fact, about a college football team at the University of Iceland. When I was talking to the editor at the press, first question he had for me is this a thing? Is there, in fact, an American college football program at the University of Iceland? Absolutely not. Right? If you live in Iceland, you'll know why that's a ridiculous thing. But I guess it's encouraging to show that the novel has enough realism that this could appear to be a thing. So why that? Well, this is kind of writing about what you know. I've always been interested in American college football. And I would say college football is a very quintessentially American thing. I think American football in general is, but it's making inroads. I mean, I guess Vienna even has its own professional football team in the European League, and they play games in London sometimes, NFL games, that is. But it's still kind of framed according to, I would say, American culture. And college football, university level football, which is an amateur sport, interestingly, that's, I think, very quintessentially American, with the pageantry and the regionalism and the kind of the drama of it. And it doesn't really exist much outside of the States. The only reason I got into it really is that I grew up close to the border and close to the University of Michigan, which has a big football program. So I thought it would be an interestingly contrarian thing to do, to take something that is very American and just drop it into Iceland and say, well, what's the effect of taking a college football program? And I should emphasize, American football, the big helmets and the ball that you carry, right, as opposed to the one that you kick. Just drop that into Iceland and sort of see the results of it. So that was the starting point, and I won't really get into the novel in any more detail, except to just give you a sense of, again, that kind of writing process where I started with it. I didn't plot it out. I didn't know exactly which direction it was going to go in when I first started writing it. All I really had when I first started was this idea of a college football team called the Puffins at the University of Iceland, and two of the main characters. There was going to be one character who was the head coach of the team, who would be a woman, which I thought was also a kind of contrarian thing to do, because if you know American football, you'll know it's very chauvinistic. It's a very masculine sport, kind of phallocentric, as they say in theory. So I thought it'd be interesting if a woman would be the head coach of the team. And the other main character that I had in mind, there are four main characters in total, but the other one I was thinking of initially would be not the coach, but the athletic director of the program. The role of athletic director is big at a lot of American universities because their sports programs are giant cash cows. And so I had this idea of these two characters. The head coach, Gwen was her name, would have a sort of idealistic view of the sport, a kind of passion for football. She's very committed to the idea of winning and the success of the program, but she has this purist football for football's sake mentality. So she'll be over here, and then I'll have the athletic director, a man named Tommy, and he too will be committed to winning. He'll be committed to the success of the football program, but instead of this purist approach like his counterpart, he will instead have a quite instrumental view of it. In other words, he'll be pushing an agenda. He wants the program to succeed for his own personal reasons. And I didn't know what his agenda was going to be when I first started writing the novel. And that's it. That was just the germ of the narrative. That's all I had when I first started writing it. Two characters. They're both on the same team. They're both working toward the same goal, but they have completely contrary intentions and, by extension, contrary personalities. And the novel just kind of grew out of that over time. So that's it. I think I've talked about everything I wanted to. So Year of the Puffin, as I say, just released for those in Iceland. Book launch soon at the end of September. If you're on the University Listserv, I'll talk about that. And until soon, see you.